water for over 35 years. She fell in love with Tasmania some time ago and then started to do an estuary program. Just to give you some context, before the global financial crisis, I was working as a consultant collecting stories about water issues from the media. The only thing, you would find a water article on pages 1 to 3 of every major metropolitan newspaper, radio the same. The only thing that knocked it off was the GFC. So this is the area that Christine works in. Sorry, you will have noted that we've got all the top people in the field. So when we ask questions rather than comments, I'd get you to ask questions so we can get as much out of it as we can. Christine, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Can people hear me? Okay, great. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I was the author of the Rivers and Wetlands theme section for the State of Environment as a consultant to the Tas Planning Commission. And I'll give a quick review of some of the key findings, the indicators that were selected for the State of Environment report.
You don't need to just leave it on the table. You don't need to worry about it. Just a microphone for my hearing aid.
Okay. That's for,
I've got it on.
okay.
If you just leave it there,
Oh,
it'll
yes.
pick you up nicely.
Great. And to
interrupt.
forward this. Sorry, yes, so a bit of a condition, trends, and recommendations. I think we've had a pretty good review of the State of Environment from Jason's really interesting talk, so I won't go into too much detail other than to say it was a very short time frame for preparation after the 2009. I mean, we had a 14 or 15 year gap, and then we had about 4 to 6 months for the consultants' originally intention to produce the key themes and to get the report out the door. So the bulk of the work was outsourced to 6 different consultants or their groups, and it was quite a complex and time-consuming process. The 6 themes are covered in the State of Environment report, the 2024, with 29 indicators, and those are the 6 themes, and I'll talk today about the Rivers and Wetlands theme. Just briefly, an overview, Tasmanian rivers. The island is subdivided into 48 major catchments. There's hundreds of rivers and river sections. The largest of those are the South Esk in the northeast, the Derwent in the southeast, the Gordon Franklin in the west, as well as the Huon and the Pieman. And as I'm sure you're all aware, the flow of the rivers varies extensively with the rainfall in a given year, with the gradient of rainfall across the state, with season and with changing climate. Over 60% of the water that falls on the island of Tasmania and runs off towards the coast is actually controlled and essentially managed by the hydro, which is quite an interesting statistic. Wetlands, we have thousands of wetlands, some of the most diverse in Australia, and these include everything from large lakes, small ponds, marshes, wooded swamps, and riparian zones. Wetlands are essential for water quality, for flood control, and for wildlife habitat. And we have 89 of Australia's listed important wetlands in Tasmania, with another 166 that have been recommended for inclusion. And that includes 10 Ramsar sites, which are internationally protected wetlands. Climate change has been mentioned. There have been 2 major studies of climate change implications for rivers, wetlands, and runoff. The Sustainable Yields CSIRO report in 2012 and Climate Futures in 2010, that was ACRC. Both of those are now well over 10 years old, and a lot has changed in that time, so they really do need updating, the conclusions of those reports. Overall, there's been a projection that the West Coast and the Central Highlands will see a decrease in rainfall and runoff, that we'll see increased flooding on the East Coast, And many rivers we've already seen reductions in flow and big changes in flood frequency, but there hasn't been a systematic analysis of most records, flow records. Indicators. Oh, it's very complicated. There's whole treatises on indicators, but as you're aware, certainly they're key measures to assess condition and to track changes over time. Ideally, they should be simple and easy to explain. More and more, a lot of indicators are going to indices where you combine multiple factors to try and cover a wider range of impacts and outcomes. Ideal state of environment report, in addition to state indicators, what's the state of our wetlands, should also include what are the pressures on that indicator and what are the responses, the management responses in particular. Some of that was done in the 2009 State of Environment Report, which was quite a good report, actually. Unfortunately, it was never printed, and it's very difficult to access it online. You have to go into the Wayback Machine to actually find the records from the 2009 report. But the 2024 focuses almost entirely on indicators of state. So for rivers and wetlands, we sat down and looked at a whole range of possible indicators for rivers and wetlands. That's the list of original indicators that were considered. I wrote up and analyzed data for the first 6 there, macroinvertebrates, also known as water bugs, water quality, wetlands extent and condition, riparian zone extent and condition. I also spent a lot of time on environmental flows and algal blooms, and I did produce draft indicator and technical reports for those. But we ran into a time crunch. I think I got all of the comments and results back a month before they were due on the minister's desk, and the Planning Commission asked me to focus on the first 4. But I will talk a little bit about the others. Native fish, water birds, groundwater level and quality. Lots of others also were considered, but there simply wasn't enough data and enough repetition of monitoring to analyze those in any substantive way. No, don't want that. Go back, let's see. No, I don't want to end show. Okay. I guess a point I'd like to make several times throughout this presentation. 3 essential foundations for healthy rivers and lakes and other aquatic systems. First, you have to have enough water to sustain the system. Second, that water needs to be clean and unpolluted. And third, you need adequate, what I call green infrastructure. Wetlands and riparian zones are essential for a healthy river system, lake system, estuarine system. And the 3 of those interact quite heavily. One affects the other, and you need all 3 of those. And then also that we do need integrated catchment management as a fundamental for long-term planning and sustainability. And we haven't done integrated catchment management particularly well in Tasmania. There's a few specific catchments where there's been a lot of work done, but it hasn't been a fundamental concern. So we'll start with just a quick run through the 6 indicators for the rivers and wetlands theme. Water quality, very important. The previous state of rivers, there was a whole series of state of river reports that were produced by the state government up until about 2008, and that include both water bugs, flow information, and water quality information. But unfortunately, that work ceased in 2008, and we haven't had, more recently there has been, I think 6 rivers have been picked up since then, but the water quality aspect still hasn't been reported on. We have a lot of water quality monitoring that is undertaken in the state, over 12 organizations, both state, government, government business enterprises, and private NGOs. Hundreds of sites, probably millions of dollars invested in water quality monitoring. But unfortunately, there's no statewide consolidation or analysis or reporting of this valuable data. Some of that work in terms of an inventory is being undertaken through the Rural Water Use Strategy. but that inventory wasn't available for the State of Environment report. So this is a major undertaking, and it really requires substantial resources, and it wasn't possible for this State of Environment, given the time and funding limits, to pull all that data together. I mean, that's probably several years effort for multiple people to actually pull that information together and analyze and report on it. There are several organizations and NGOs who published sector-specific, for example, the Drinking Water Quality Report published by TasWater, the Tamar Estuary Program and the Derwent Estuary Program have also published several catchment-specific reports for the Derwent and the Tamar. So for the reasons indicated on the previous slide, water quality condition was assessed to be unknown. Trend is unknown, and the reliability, but there's so many different programs monitoring water quality, is unknown. Probably fairly good. I mean, a lot of these are very professional organizations and use accredited labs. So good opportunity here, but we need to actually do the follow-up work in the state to get value out of all that effort that's being expended. Second indicator is water bugs. So water bugs are macroinvertebrates. They're tiny insects, worms, and snails. They are visible to the naked eye, but usually you look at them under a scanning scope or other enlargement things. And the type and abundance of water bugs often reflects the overall condition of waterways. It's not a perfect indicator, but it's quite a good indicator. And there has been a river health monitoring program that's been undertaken by now NRE that's been operating for well over 20 years now. Quite a well-respected program, good scientist, and there's valuable information there on conditions and trends, which I'll point out in the next slide, which have been shown to be declining. However, the funding for that program has been reduced quite strongly since about 2018. From over 100 sites, we're down to about 50 sites that are monitored statewide, and where it used to be monitoring every year, twice yearly, that's also been reduced to just biannual monitoring. So that really makes it difficult to feel confident that the program is able to deliver necessary information for a timely response. If it's every 2 years, generally they need 5 years worth of data to have statistical confidence in trends. And so if it takes 10 years to get those 5 years of data, well, you've possibly passed some pretty important milestones during that period. So the indicator, the condition was determined as fair. That's based on the results from the longer-term history that somewhere between 50 and 70% of sites were healthy, but 30 and up to 50%, depending on the time period and the number of sites, the location of the sites monitored, are impaired. And similarly, somewhere in the order of 20 to 30% have declined in condition during the 2009 to 2022 period. So that's macroinvertebrates. Rivers and wetlands. The next indicator I looked into was wetlands. There was quite an excellent piece of inventory work back in 2004 called the Conservation of Freshwater Ecosystem Values. And that looked at wetlands mostly based on remote sensing and some other work across the state, and did a basic inventory of what we've got, where it is, and the condition of it. There's a fair bit of information that we've lost large areas of our original wetlands to land clearing and inundation over the years. And land clearing does continue in many parts of the state, some legally and some illegally. Fire can be a serious risk as well for wetlands. But I guess despite several good news projects, restoration of the Lagoon of Islands, for example, by Hydro Tasmania, and the carp eradication program at Lake Sorell by the Inland Fisheries Commission, Tasmania really has no specific wetland policy. We have limited regulation of wetlands, and there's no dedicated staff for wetland management within the state government. There was one individual who retired and was not replaced. So that was quite concerning. I looked around nationally at what other states doing, and for example, Queensland has a whole division of wetlands with, I don't know, 20 plus staff and millions of dollars of funding. Come down here. So, in summary, because the work that was done for conservation of freshwater ecosystem values back in 2003, 2004 has not been repeated, we really don't know how our wetlands are trending, but there have been multiple incidents of legal and illegal clearing of wetlands, so almost certainly declining, and the reliability of that data is quite poor. Finally, riparian zones. These are the vegetated areas between land and waterways, and for this State of Environment report we used a 50-meter on either side definition, which was the number that was used in the previous State of Environment report. And these areas are really essential for river health. They provide shade, which prevents water temperature increases in rivers. Stabilize the banks so you don't get erosion and sedimentation in your waterways. Filter runoff from adjacent land areas, particularly nutrients and sediments, and provide really important habitat, for example, for platypus, for the azure kingfisher, and lots of other both aquatic and terrestrial animals. It has been estimated that about 20% of the original riparian zones in Tasmania are still extant, and an analysis of the proportion of modified land within each of those 48 catchments across the state suggests that we've had about 70% of our rivers, based on the amount of modified vegetation, are likely impaired, and 31% significantly so, due to that loss of riparian vegetation. Another analysis that was done was on woody vegetation, also based on satellite imagery, and that suggests that not only have we lost a lot of that original, up to 80% of our original riparian cover, but just since 2009, in various catchments across the state, additional loss has been somewhere between another 5 to 21% of what's remaining. Rivers in the World Heritage Area are in better condition, but recent fires have been a real risk and have damaged some of the riparian corridors in the World Heritage Areas in particular. There is some good news projects. The TIER has done some really interesting work analyzing the condition of riparian zones in the North and South Esk river catchments. And the Tas Land Conservancy has been very active in acquiring land areas with riparian and wetland habitats. So the summary from the State of Environment report was really the condition is, while the work was done using both the, it was a TASVEG modified land category in riparian zones and the woody vegetation, there are a lot of unknowns about the accuracy of some of that, and also that work didn't extend up into the higher level, higher elevation riparian zones. So condition likely fair to poor, clearly is getting worse, and the reliability of the information, a lot of work needs to be done to improve that to a higher level of reliability. So two indicators that didn't make the final cut. One was environmental flows, which are the flow regimes needed to maintain river condition and habitat So that includes a flow regime, that's the volume of flows that come down a river, the frequency with which different levels of flow are repeated, and also the timing of flow. Summer is a particularly critical time. A lot of our rivers dry up or become quite stagnant, and that's particularly problematical both for water quality and for habitat. There are a lot of environmental flow studies funded in the mid-2000s particularly, and targets were set for more than 20 rivers across the state. We do have a good network of flow gauges for the most part. Hydro has excellent resources around flow measurements, but there's been very limited follow-up or reporting on whether those targets that were originally set have been met, or indeed whether they need to be updated to reflect, for example, climate change and other factors. During this time, there's been big increase in direct water takes, particularly for irrigation, construction of farm dams, and extraction of groundwater. And many of these extractions are not routinely metered, and there's no regular monitoring of how much water is actually taken from our rivers, groundwaters, or put into farm dams. We have allocation information. We know how much water people are allowed to take, but there's no reporting back on how much actually has been taken for the most part. So without that, it's very difficult to know whether the environmental flow targets are being achieved, or even if the allocations are being fully allocated or over-allocated or under-allocated. And climate change will further complicate this picture. Just a couple case studies. January 2020, the South Esk, which is one of the biggest rivers in the state, actually ceased to flow for several weeks. Incredibly, this didn't make the news. The causes for it were never actually followed up on. My understanding is there was a fair amount of irrigation that was extracted all at the same time, and basically the river at Perth pretty much dried up for 2 weeks. But that, to me, that's extraordinary that our river, one of the largest rivers in the state, could dry up. Another example is of environmental flow issues is the Greater Southeast Irrigation Scheme, which has just been promised funding at the federal level, $150 million in funding. One of the largest irrigation proposals in the state, and the fundamental environmental flow studies to confirm particularly that summer water is available for that scheme have not been done. There have been previous studies in 2002 that recommended no further summer extractions to protect the lower part of the Derwent River and the estuary. But those, and they were quite good studies for the time, but those haven't been updated or repeated. And the recent algal blooms and taste and odor problems we've had in the upper part of the Derwent really highlight the vulnerability of the system. The sixth indicator that I did a fair bit of work on was algal blooms, which is often reported in State of Environment reports from different states. This includes both microscopic and visible forms of algae, and blue-green algae is particularly of concern as it can be both a nuisance because, for example, it produces taste and odor compounds and can also sometimes be toxic. Also, with increasing water temperatures, increasing nutrient discharges, reduced river flows, and loss of riparian shade, you really increase your algal bloom risks. And particularly in catchments where you have a series of reservoirs and dams, such as the Derwent. And once established, if you get them in your system, they're pretty much impossible to eradicate. I mean, we've certainly seen that nationally and globally. So while we haven't had super severe widespread algal blooms in Tasmania, there have been several major issues. For example, Lake Trevally, after I think over 10 years with no algal blooms, they had quite a big one last January. The lower Derwent with the taste and odor issues, which contributed to the upgrading of the Burneston water treatment plant. And Craigborne Dam has been sort of regularly closed to fishing and other activities. There's also a number of smaller lakes and dams around the state. But I guess the key is taking a really proactive management approach to just preventing algal blooms. We really don't want them. We should be monitoring very carefully, reporting carefully, and just tracking these. So it does, as I said, once they're in your system, very expensive. And it's not just an environmental, it's a human health issue and an economic issue as well. In summary, I think Eric's going to look at this table more carefully. This is a great little color-coded view of all of the indicators and how they were assessed. But the monitoring programs and data for rivers and wetlands in many cases were insufficient to assess condition and trends for most river and wetland indicators. Most trends suggest that we are seeing worsening conditions across the state as a whole. We do have some really excellent water quality monitoring programs across the state, but that really does need to be compiled to enable statewide reporting. And our wetlands and riparian habitats are really undervalued and poorly protected. There was really only one. I was a bit disappointed when I saw the recommendations from the State of Environment 2024. The recommendations were produced by the TAS Planning Commission based on the indicator reports and technical reports provided by the different themes. The recommendation essentially was quite broad: develop a broader water policy monitoring and reporting approach, which I completely agree with, but I had hoped to see something a bit more specific, and actually provided, I think, 2 pages of very specific recommendations. So I've mentioned some of those, which are my own personal opinion, not of TAS Planning Commission opinion. And they do actually mention the first one in the finer text under their recommendation, which is, one is to produce a follow-up State of Rivers report. New Zealand has recently released one of these for the country as a whole. But that should include the consolidated water quality, the environmental flows, and the algal blooms information. Second, we really need a substantial increase in funding to rebuild our monitoring programs. We had a lot of really great work done, 10, 15, 20 years ago in Tasmania. A lot of that was federally funded, but once the federal funding dropped away, so did a lot of the support for that work. We need to rebuild our monitoring programs, not just for water quality, but for wetlands, for riparian zones, a whole range of different things. Update the climate models, support multi-stakeholder data compilation and reporting. The last time I could find information on how much funding the Water Resources Division at NRE received was in 2001, and they only got 3% of NRE funding, their second worst funded division in NRE. And you just can't run a substantial, and that includes not just monitoring, but also water management across the board. So that's very underfunded. Establishing an independent water department and a wetlands section to look after wetlands more carefully. Improving policy, regulations, and incentives to conserve water and to reduce pollution. I mean, for example, without water metering, you really have no idea what's happening with your water. We need also integrated accounting systems that look at not just direct takes from rivers, but also groundwater extractions and how much water is being diverted and retained in farm dams, because all of those interact in the water accounting systems. Irrigation efficiency has been very low priority, but how much could we save just by more efficient irrigation systems rather than continuing to take more water out of our rivers? And flow-through fish farms is another one of my concerns, in that there's very little treatment of those wastes, and there's at least a dozen flow-through fish farms on our rivers in Tasmania for production of smolt for the salmon industry. And finally, we need much better policy legislation and incentives to conserve and restore wetlands and riparian zones. So that's it for me. Thank you for your time, and happy to take questions.
Okay, so sticking to the program, we've got 6 minutes for questions. Christine, you happy to take questions? Go for it.
Just a quick one, Christine. I grew up in Launceston where, you know, dredging the Tamar and North-Est and South-Est and all that jazz has just been an endless issue there. Basically, the only recommendation I've ever heard is undam the river is the only way to solve these issues. And we used to swim in the North-Est in Perth, where the river ended, and then the water quality got so bad that there was just a big sign saying, "Please do not swim in the river anymore." You've painted a pretty bleak picture, and I suppose how do we best advocate for the waterways or improvements, and what can we do, especially in Launceston where I'm from? Do you have any thoughts on fixing any of these issues?
Well, we've moved into estuaries.
Yeah.
And that's another interesting thing about the State of Environment report was that estuarine water quality was specifically not included in the rivers and wetlands theme. And that's a bit of an area that probably needs to, again, be picked up in the next State of Environment report. I mean, there's some good work being done both by the Derwent Estuary Program and the Tamar Estuaries Group. Yeah, I think I think that's probably a good question for the tier. You know, they do have a program on water quality improvements. It's interesting, a lot of their monitoring is based in the estuary, but a lot of their on-ground works, I think, are based largely in the catchment around riparian fencing, particularly. I don't have a specific answer, sorry.
Christine, do you think there's an argument for us to have more than the 2 estuary authorities?
Argument to have, sorry?
More than just the 2 estuary authorities that we
Oh,
have?
well, yeah, I think so. I mean, I think those are good models. And they're the only 2 organizations who actually regularly collect, compile, and report on water quality data, for example. For rivers and wetlands, though, the freshwater part of those programs is somewhat limited. Much of what they do is estuarine-based. The catchment at the Derwent, I think the Derwent has done 2 or 3 snapshots of water quality in the catchment. The Tamar has done, I think, 2, and that's over the past 20 or 30 years. So they're not particularly catchment focused in their monitoring and reporting. But yeah, that could be a model for rolling that out to other, but I think you need to really bring in the catchments much more actively. I mean, most of Tasmania's population is based around estuaries. Burnie, Devonport, Hobart. I mean, the inland populations are really quite small. And in many cases, I mean, for example, the Derwent historically had excellent water quality because there was very little development up the catchment. But that's changing really quickly in a lot of places. I think the Northwest and the Northeast have had much more agricultural development. And so their rivers are in poorer condition. But even just, you know, recommencing the state of river reporting, I mean, often starting with collecting and reporting on the information you've got and then building onto that. So, you know, here's the information, here are the issues, and then what are we going to do about it? And that's where building a coalition of people that have particularly influence on those matters is really important.
On the news about 5 days ago, did you hear about Peter Dutton's announcement?
Sorry, I'm a bit hard of hearing.
Oh, on the news about 5 days ago, did you hear Peter Dutton's announcement?
The which announcement?
Peter Dutton's announcement about the irrigation.
Oh, yes, I saw both.
What were your thoughts on that?
I have been talking with Tas Irrigation, NRE, and the Hydro for literally 4 years about, you know, sustainable irrigation is in principle a great idea, but let's start by, do we have the water available in summer to sustain it? And so I've been asking again and again, where's the environmental flow studies that say that we actually have this much water to deliver? And the answer I keep getting is, we'll do those studies once we get the funding. But then you've raised, supposing there wasn't enough money, you've raised some pretty high expectations that this is going to happen anyway. So I'm going to continue to campaign and try to, it just needs to be done. And if there's not enough flow in summer, you have to build in storages for the winter takes. It's not just, and then the other good part of it is, could we get more bang for the buck through better water efficiency? So why not start with efficiency and see, and also selection of crops. What crops are most suitable for a really dry part of the state. So.
I think with this sediment issue in the Tamar, right, that's been driven significantly, in my mind, from my observations over the last 20 years or more, by the expansion of pivot irrigators throughout the Midlands area, especially in that low-lying country that used to be grazing land that would act as the filter before that water would hit the river. Now that's all gone into pivot irrigators, so whenever a flood comes through now, those paddocks are then often cultivated at least, sometimes twice a year or more. So they're bared off, they're not covered with grass. That soil gets picked up immediately and dumped in the estuary. And it's blatantly obvious. I've got some great photographs flying over pivot irrigators that have been built in these floodplain areas, where you can clearly see the water just tracking through the pivots, picking up that soil and depositing in the Tamar.
There's two issues there. One is the delivery of sediment to the river and the delivery of that to the estuary. And clearly that's where riparian zones are incredibly important, maintaining
the fencing
those.
requirement is only 10 metres if you do fence for them anyway. So if you talk about a 50-metre riparian zone, you don't see that anywhere.
What's suitable? And I've talked to people who say, look, that's in many cases the most valuable part of their farmland in terms of the soils and everything else. So having some sort of incentives to fence that off is really important. You can't just say, we're going, you've always farmed that, we're going to take it off you now. So incentives are incredibly important there. But I guess the other thing I'll mention is that the delivery of sediment to the estuary is an important aspect, but the circulation of that estuary will constantly bring the sediment back up. So it flows into the estuary, it gets flushed downstream, and then the currents actually bring the sediments regularly back up again. So it doesn't actually exit out the other end. So you're building up a whole legacy of mobile sediments.
But it is never returning to that farmland.
No, it's not going to get back to, unless you truck it back up and put it on the riparian zone and plant some trees. But then it's salty, so it's a little.
Sometimes we go and just put in a better water filtration facility rather than going, well, what is the root cause of this? And how do we help those farmers address that root cause? And be prepared as a society to put the funding into making decent-sized riparian zones which do give that proper filtration, and ensure that we've got shading of the rivers and stop algal blooms, etc.
Anyone else?
You said the regulations around wetlands and clearing are insufficient. Does Tas planning have any regulations saying you can't just pave over a wetland and put up a suburb?
So there's Forestry Practices Act has some protection for wetlands, but there are a lot of variations. For example, for agriculture, so it's not 100% guaranteed. And then some wetlands are more protected than others. So there's a certain list of wetlands on threatened species, threatened communities that get protection, but others don't. And then there's just a lot of illegal clearing of wetlands as well. Some planning schemes also, I think, try to protect wetlands and riparian zones. But again, it doesn't tend to apply to agricultural activities.
So it's a lack of penalties and enforcement for the illegal clearing that should be of concern.
And I think there's a lot more in the State of Environment under biodiversity that talks about illegal clearing. So wetlands kind of comes under that as well. Chris?
Christine, we once had a water quality management policy, which was a sustainable development policy, Did that die in the ditch? Is this inappropriate? Or-
It was supposed to be reviewed, I think,
because it was
probably,
meant to be
what,
developing
15 years
protected
ago?
Environmental values for all these waterways. And
Yeah, yeah. That we had protected environmental values and water quality objectives and all kinds of things.
yeah.
It's pretty, if it's not dead, it's moribund, shall we say, I would say. I mean, it's very rarely raised. You know, there's some use of water quality objectives for point source discharges, but they're basically set for just that section of the river. Yeah.
From your knowledge, you're currently an expert in this area. Is any international studies or research, any other country we can learn, or for example, European countries, we can learn from them how they can balance the environmental protection and the economic growth, how they balance,
Yeah.
we can learn from.
That's a good question. Are there other countries that do it better? Are there other states that do it better? I mean, I think
So
Victoria.
we can share the knowledge.
Yeah, Victoria's got some pretty good work going on around rivers and wetlands. Queensland has a fantastic wetland, monitoring and reporting as part of the Great Barrier Reef Action Plan. Sometimes I think if you go to countries and you look at the river in a city and it's clean, they're doing it right. So, Switzerland, Germany, parts of Scandinavia. I don't know the details, but I mean, clearly we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We could look around and adopt some pretty sensible things.
Okay, Eric,
Okay.
let's do the switcheroo.
Thank you.
Eric, I'll get you to stay up here so we
No, I get that.
the
Borrow this.
Yep.
Thank you very much. And up there.
Yeah, that's fine.
It's actually better here.
Okay, good to need.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so Eric's primary research is in seabirds and shorebirds, hence he's talking about the estuarine and coastal regions in our state. He's got over 200 peer-reviewed papers. I thought 100 was a lot.